Opposition parties pounce. The media hyperventilates. The governing party scrambles amid accusations of shady dealings in pursuit of favors for friends, personal perks, or to find electoral favor down the road. It sounds nefarious, and it may indeed be nefarious. But it might also be the dirty little not-so-secret truth about politics that governing means getting your feet dirty as you make your way through the muck. Here for a little straight talk in the nation's capital, Rachel Curran. She's former Director of Policy for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, now practitioner in residence in political management at Carleton University. And here in our studio, Greg Sorbara, former Ontario Finance Minister, now Chancellor at York University, and Peggy Nash, former NDP Member of Parliament, now a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University. Delighted to have you three with us here tonight for a very timely subject. I want to start with this. At both the federal and provincial levels, there are examples of First Ministers doing some things that some people see as terribly partisan and unethical, and others see in a different way. I'm trying to be very neutral in the way I'm describing this. In Ottawa, of course, it's the SNC-Lavalin story. Here in the province of Ontario, until very recently, it was, did Premier Ford sort of fix things so that he could appoint his good friend to be the head of the Ontario Provincial Police? I don't want to characterize these scandals. I want you to. And in fact, I shouldn't even say the word scandal. Rachel, to you first. How scandalous do you think these stories are?
So, look, I think SNC-Lavalin, this whole case, is in fact a real scandal. Look, Steve, I know we're talking about, how often do political considerations come into making policy decisions? Happens all the time. How often do governments look to appoint people who are friendly to their agenda or who they see as philosophically aligned with them? Happens all the time. There's a real difference, though, with SNC-Lavalin. One of the core constitutional principles that we operate by is prosecutorial independence, that there has to be independence in the prosecution of criminal cases, and that there cannot be political interference in that. That's a clear red line. So look, that's why SNC-Lavalin, in my view, is actually a real problem, actually a real scandal. It's because the government was attempting to interfere in decisions around who would be criminally prosecuted and how that would happen. That is a very different thing, in my opinion, from applying a political lens to policy decisions, or even appointing friends or people who might be sympathetic to the government. Those things happen. Are they great? Maybe not. But this is on a different level. This SNC issue is an entirely different level because of this issue around prosecutorial independence and the rule of law. So that's what distinguishes it, in my view, from these other cases.
Okay, let me be a bit of a jerk here. Yeah. How about Nigel Wright writing a $90,000 check to make a Mike Duffy problem go away? Is that a scandal or is that just a problem?
Well, look, it absolutely was a scandal. It was a real problem for the Harper government. They took a political hit from this, and they never actually recovered from that. The numbers went down, support numbers went down for the Harper government in 2013, and they never really came back up to pre-Duffy levels. But let's be honest, that scandal, that so-called scandal, was about the government trying to find a way to repay $90,000 to the Canadian Treasury that it felt had been inappropriately billed to taxpayers. Now, was that repayment or was that attempt to get the money back to the government appropriate? Probably not. It shouldn't have been the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff who was writing a check out of his personal account to pay that money back. But that's very different from attempting to interfere in the criminal prosecution of a company engaged in corrupt practices.
Okay, understood.
Not just globally, but in Canada.
Let's get some feedback here in the studio. We're trying, Greg Sorbara, to make a distinction between what's a problem for a government and what is a genuine example of genuinely scandalous behavior. How do you weigh in?
Well, the first thing I did is I looked up scandal in the dictionary. A scandal is an event or an action that is morally or legally wrong and gives rise to public outrage. So my problem with the SNC-Lavalin thing is I can't see the mischief. I disagree entirely with what we just heard. I mean, what went on in Ottawa on the SNC-Lavalin matter is that the Minister of Justice came under significant pressure from the Prime Minister's office to get independent legal advice before she made a decision on whether to go down this road or that road. And the Prime Minister's office, in doing that, did what it ought to have done. What hung in the balance was the future of a very significant Canadian corporations. There were two roads. We can do a deferred prosecution agreement, or we can go the criminal court route. It was up to, and it always was up to, the Minister of Justice to make that decision. The Prime Minister's office urged repeatedly and forcefully for the minister to get independent legal advice before she made that decision. She refused to do that. And that's up to her. There was no wrong, there was no mischief. The Prime Minister's office did not win the case. Then what happened? Well, there was a cabinet shuffle, and Minister of Justice was shuffled. And that's entirely within the discretion of the Prime Minister to move that minister. Did he do it because of SNC-Lavalin? I believe not. But there's nothing morally wrong. I mean, we all know about cabinet shuffles and how some ministers are disappointed. I was one back in 1987. But you just accept it.
That's a reference to the fact that you got shuffled out of a job that you really
Loved.
enjoyed
Yeah.
for one that you didn't love so much.
Yeah, because the Premier at that time wasn't very happy with me. But, you accept it. Yeah. And then after all of that, the former Minister of Justice decides to go public, to resign and go public with the notion that she was under undue pressure. My answer to that is, if you don't like being under undue pressure, don't take a cabinet seat.
But if I read you right here, if I read you right, you're saying not only is this not a scandal, but it's not even a problem, really. It's sort of a difference of opinion here.
Well, it's a problem for the Prime Minister because two of his ministers have resigned. And that shows a lack of confidence. I'm just saying it's not a scandal. I don't understand the public outrage. And, the Prime Minister has lost two ministers that he relied on. But no one did anything wrong. Not Judy Wilson-Raybould, not Jane Philpott, not the Prime Minister, not Jerry Butts. They were doing their work. Unfortunately, the curtain was pulled back and the public got to see the mucky business that is politics. Let me just go to the OPP thing for a moment.
Well, hold off on that, because I suspect Peggy wants. We'll come back to the Taverner situation. And before you speak, let's thank you for being here, because you're really fighting a bit of a throat problem right now. So.
I apologize for my voice. So I think one of the issues around the SNC-Lavalin situation is that we still don't have all the facts. We have an ethics investigation which is going to look very narrowly on whether on the ethics of this situation, and we have a Justice Committee review, which of course is dominated by Liberals. So we don't really have an independent investigation. I guess we'll find out later today if the Justice Committee will allow Judy Wilson-Raybould to come back and give her full testimony, and whether other witnesses may be called. So we still don't know the whole story. But I would say that...
do we have a scandal here?
I would say yes, we do. And the reason I say this is, of course, ministers come under pressure. Of course, there's politics involved in who gets what position and what policy position governments take. It's inherently political. But there needs to be a sharp line between your prosecution system and the politics of government. So we have a director of public prosecutions. She came to a decision. And the role of the Attorney General is just to decide, do you uphold that investigation, which in the vast majority of cases is done, or do you decide that you need to intervene and make a different decision? Our former Attorney General decided, yes, for various reasons, we should uphold that decision. Clearly, the government didn't like her decision.
Yeah, well, Peggy,
they wanted her to make a different decision.
But I'm going to urge. Let me urge all of you.
Some people say, well, But her decision was upheld.
Okay, but
we don't know if it's going
Peggy,
to be
I'm jumping in
upheld.
here. I'm jumping in here because what I don't want to do tonight is I don't want to relitigate all the details of this case. We're trying to really understand what the nature of scandal is in the country right now and whether we've got a full-throated, full-blown, shocking scandal.
I did not go to Wikipedia and look up the word.
Or whether we don't. So let me try this. Like Watergate was a shocking scandal.
Yeah.
Rachel, do we have, is it appropriate to use the word shocking to describe, in your view, what's going on in Ottawa right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And this attempt to downplay, look, Mr. Sabara's attempt to sort of downplay this as the regular business of government, this happens all the time, is just completely untrue. This is genuinely a scandal because what's at stake is the integrity of our system of government. What's at stake is whether we are actually a country governed by the rule of law or not. Now, look, for non-lawyers, this may seem kind of wonky, but decisions around who gets prosecuted criminally and how that happens and whether that's independent of political actors, it's actually a really fundamental principle of our system and really important to keep that separate from all the political machinations that go on around other files.
Okay.
So this is actually really different, and really what is at stake is the integrity of our system of governance. Like there's no kind of way of sugarcoating that. And so yes, this is a scandal. It should be a scandal because the stakes are so high.
All right, let's understand, again, Greg Sabara, you wanted to bring up the Taverna situation, where the allegation is that the Premier sort of cooked things so to reduce the standards, the qualifications for the next OPP chief in order to have his friend considered when he otherwise would not have been considered. Again, I want to get an understanding of the nature of this kind of situation. Would you call this a shocking, scandalous situation?
No, I would call it a scandal, a simple scandal. Again, go back to the definition. An event that or an action that is morally or legally wrong and gives rise to public outrage. That's a pretty clear definition. The scandal here is simple, and that is this. It doesn't matter how qualified a candidate is to be the commissioner of the OPP. He could be the very best on the face of the earth. He can't take the job if he is a close personal friend of the Premier.
Why not? It's the Premier's appointment.
That's right. No, it's the Cabinet's appointment.
Well, who runs the Cabinet?
Well, it's a Cabinet appointment. The reason is because the OPP regularly, over the course of the history of our government, may be investigating someone in that government, including the Premier or one of his ministers. Look at the previous government. Pat Sorbara was being investigated. David Livingston was being investigated. Laura Miller was being investigated by the OPP. If the commissioner is a very close friend of the Premier, he is compromised in his ability to make a decision as to whether or not, you can be sure that those things in the previous government went to the commissioner for an okay or not an okay. And it has never happened. When Dalton McGuinty appointed the commissioner of the OPP, he appointed Julian Fantino. And he did so because there was a very good distance. Julian was a conservative, a good cop. He had worked very hard. He was worthy of the job. You just can't make the chief of police your close personal friend who comes to your barbecue. It doesn't work. It's not legally wrong, but it's morally wrong, and it did give rise to public outrage.
Peggy Nash, is this a shockingly scandalous situation that the Premier may have tried to insert his friend as the Chief Commissioner of the OPP?
I think it is also a scandal. Just as we said, SNC-Lavalin is a scandal because there's an attempt or perceived attempt to compromise the prosecutorial system. This is a perceived attempt to influence the highest level of policing in our province. And I remember when the police used to have these stickers on their cars and they would give them out, whether you support the police. And that was deemed to be not acceptable because it was politicizing the role of the police. In other words, I may not want to have a sticker. Does that mean you're going to give me a ticket and not give somebody else a ticket? If I'm the Premier and you're my best friend, am I not going to come down hard on you when I should? People need to know that the rule of law will prevail and that the police are enforcing the law. And in that enforcement, there is complete independence.
Presumably, it could have had the for the Premier's point of view, perversely opposite effect, which is that if a sticky issue came onto Ron Taverner's desk as Chief Commissioner of the OPP, he might have, in an attempt to bend over backwards and seem untouched by his friendship, he might have been tougher on the Premier and the Premier's government than he might otherwise have been. Can you imagine that scenario?
I can imagine it, but I don't think we want to put ourselves as a province in that situation. I do think there needs to be that independence, that clarity, that confidence of the people of Ontario that their law enforcement system is not going to fall prey to the political will of the government in power.
Rachel Curran, in your view, the attempt to have Ron Taverner appointed as Chief Commissioner of the OPP, how scandalous was that in your view?
Well, look, I think this is a faux scandal. I mean, governments of all stripes appoint people sympathetic to them or their friends into positions of power all the time. I
Even
mean,
as Chief Commissioner of the OPP?
Yeah, listen, look, even Justin Trudeau, a gentleman who'd worked on his campaign campaign platform, was appointed into the senior ranks of the nonpartisan civil service in the Privy Council office as soon as he came into power. All of these Senate appointments that Mr. Trudeau is making, they're voting with the government. These supposedly independent senators are voting with the government 85-90% of the time.
Peggy Nash
look,
makes the point that the police are different. The justice system is different in her view.
Yeah, look, there needs to be, I think, a perception of independence. But as you have pointed out, there may be, if a file comes across Mr. Taverner's desk where he thinks he may be judged on the closeness of his relationship to Doug Ford, he may go too far in the opposite direction, take the opposite tack to avoid leaving the impression that he is too closely tied to the government. So, look, I think people are appointed into these positions who the government likes, who leaders like, all of the time. This happens under every stripe of government. And look, I don't think singling out Ron Taverner's appointment makes any, sure, we can try and sort of cram this under the scandal heading. I don't think it's any different from what governments do every single day, including the Trudeau government.
All right, let me get to Greg Sorbert on this one. You served, I was going to say, you're in the cabinet of two premiers, I think, right? Yeah, David Peterson, Dalton McGuinty, and certainly you were on, you're part of the Liberal family when Kathleen Wynne was premier. Can you hearken back to a time in your experience where the premier might have come to you and said, Greg, I know the facts and the merits of this case line up to have you make this decision, but I actually want you to make this decision because it would be better for whatever, X, Y, and Z, or political prospects, whatever. Anything come to mind?
Yeah. Going back to the Peterson era, we had very different views about labor reform and health and safety reform. And I went down a road that the Premier was not happy with.
You were too pro-labor.
In his view, I was too pro-labor. I think I did the right thing, but of course, that's a subjective opinion. But there was a lot of pressure. And again, if you take the job, you have to be willing to be under pressure. And sometimes there's no right or wrong answer. Sometimes you have to say, you know what, Premier, I defer to your judgment on this. And sometimes you have to say, I think I'm going down the right track. And if you want to veto what I do in cabinet, you can go ahead and do that. That can always happen. These decisions, after all, are cabinet decisions.
How did this circumstance resolve itself?
Well, we passed the legislation and we put it in place. And a year later, I was shuffled out of labor.
So you got your way, but you paid a price for it.
Well, I paid a price. I think I did the right thing. The legislation has stood the test of time. It was changed slightly. But it's part of the way in which it's done. In the McGuinty government, we had some severe disagreements on how to approach the minimum wage issue. And in fact, because we had disagreements, I actually did what Judy Wilson-Raybould did not do. I went out and got some independent advice as to the impact of changing the minimum wage, how that would affect the workplace. But in the end, the decision in the final budget looked more like Dalton McGuinty's resolution of the matter than it did my resolution of the matter. But that's how government works. It's a collective undertaking.
Let's get into the Harper PMO a bit on this one. I want to know whether or not, Rachel, you ever came as a policy person in Stephen Harper's office to the Prime Minister and said, the merits of the case line up this way, and he said to you, that's very interesting, but we're going to go this way, and here's why.
Oh, all of the time. But listen, also, look, Greg's right. Political considerations are always part of every policy analysis, policy work on any file. There were plenty of times when I needed to call up a minister and say, hey, look, have you considered these political factors? The Prime Minister's concerned about the politics of this. Yes, he's largely with you on the policy side, but we need to think about the politics of this also. That happens all the time. Those conversations are happening every day. Here's the difference with the SNC-Lavalin matter. We would never have called up the Minister of Justice functioning as the Attorney General. And here's where I think our system is a little bit confusing. We have a Minister of Justice who's a political figure and should be engaged in these political discussions. But the Minister of Justice, when he or she is acting as the Attorney General, is acting in a very different role. And there is simply no way we in the Harper PMO would have ever called up the Attorney General and said, look, we need to talk to you about this criminal prosecution case. We're worried about political factors vis-a-vis that case. That is a very different issue than calling up the Minister of Justice and saying, have you considered the political factors vis-a-vis this legislation that you're about to introduce on a particular issue? So part of the confusion here is that we have one person wearing two hats. The Minister of Justice is the Minister of Justice and also the Attorney General. You can have political conversations with the Minister of Justice. You cannot have political conversations with the Attorney General vis-a-vis criminal prosecution cases. You just can't.
Well, that's just patently wrong. It's just wrong.
No.
What do you mean?
It's not.
No, it's wrong on so many fronts. First of all, there were no political considerations. There are public policy considerations dealing with a very large, important corporate entity, just like there were public policy consideration when we saved the auto industry 10 years ago. So it wasn't politics. We weren't trying to achieve a political end. Secondly, there was no attempt to intimidate the minister. There was urging, which was forceful, asking the minister to get independent legal advice before she made the decision. That was the case over and over again. Not you have to go down this road, but please get into. And it was suggested that Beverly McLaughlin be retained to give her that advice. She said, "I don't want to do that."
Yeah. Let me, Peggy Nash. I want to get Peggy in, but again, not to argue the specifics of the SNC-Lavalin case, but to comment on the overarching notion that you're politicians, you deal in politics. Should we be mortified by the fact that leaders actually take political considerations into account when they make decisions?
Of course they take political considerations into account. Political parties are consumed with politics. That's what they are. But, I do believe that the two cases we're talking about are different. We're not talking about, do you go down this policy road or that policy road? We're talking about the rule of law and the independence of our judicial system. And I mean, even the OECD has expressed concern that in the enforcement of our anti-bribery law, which we have signed on to, that we may be trying to exert political control over political influence, over the prosecutorial system, and that we might be taking into account considerations which were expressly excluded, which is national economic interests.
I do get all that, but I want to.
So I want to say that, of course, there are political considerations with everything, but there is a line, and you can't cross that line. Have others crossed the line in the past? Perhaps they have, but we had federally an attorney general who, because of her personal history as an Indigenous woman, said, no, we're not going to do that.
I'm going to try my best once again just to sort of remove this from SNC and to talk about the overarching philosophical issue here, which is I think members of the public want to know whether it's okay, whether it's consistent with good democratic practices when a prime minister or a premier says, I don't really care about the facts here. I don't care if the merits line up your way. Good politics tells me we've got to go a different way. Is that okay?
It might not matter on many things, except this, it does.
Okay, this one's different. I get it.
But you're talking about
That's
rule
just not
of
true.
law.
I'm not talking about this one. I'm talking about in general.
You're talking about the rule of law, and it is different than if you're talking about auto policy or good transportation policy. You're talking about the rules under which we govern ourselves and the enforcement of those rules.
Okay, Rachel, come on in.
Yeah, look, that's completely appropriate, of course. Look, voters are the customers. For any politician, constituents, Canadian voters are the ones that that matter. These are the people who are going to, live with the results of whatever policy decision the government makes. And so, of course, their interests, of course, political interests have to be taken into account. And again, that happens on every single file. What the government is trying to do is really operate at the nexus of good policy and good politics. And every file, every policy discussion is a decision about where to draw that line. There is never a decision that's made entirely in the abstract on policy issues or on political issues. It's always a combination of those, and I think that's totally appropriate in a democratic system.
Okay.
But as Peggy says, there is a real difference with respect to SNC-Lavalin, and that's why this is such a problem.
Understood. One of the things that has been interesting about the SNC-Lavalin is that it has really peeled the curtain back on how a lot of stuff works in Ottawa, and in particular, lobbying. We saw a company lobby the Prime Minister, his principal secretary, the clerk of the Privy Council, members of Parliament, pretty much everybody in order to get a desired decision. And I guess there's some, Greg, come on in on this, there's some difference of opinion as to what of that was acceptable lobbying and consistent with good corporate practices and governance in Ottawa, and what crossed a line. I presume you have been lobbied in your day as Minister of Finance by corporations. So give us a sense about what's okay and what crosses a line.
What's okay is a good, solid case, well presented, with a perspective that has a rational basis. What isn't acceptable is a case that has threats associated with it. If you don't do that, we will make sure that you are destroyed in the next election. And I've had the full spectrum.
Give me a for instance where somebody said that to you. The latter.
You know what? I have one or two, but I really don't want to go into it. But but that does happen. I can imagine. SNC-Lavalin is a sophisticated company. I think their lobbying would be more along the lines that the banks do. The banks have a lot of lobbyists. They are always there.
The clerk called the former clerk of the Privy Council called the current clerk of the Privy Council with a private 9-minute phone call. It was not note taken or recorded, and that didn't seem kosher.
Well, I don't know. I know the previous clerk, Kevin Lynch, and he was chair of SNC-Lavalin. I think he had a responsibility to make the case. And the current clerk, I think, understands that he has to listen, evaluate, and then get on with his job. Again, the thing that really just throws this whole thing into a kind of a nether wonderland is that the decision that Jody wanted and Jane wanted and others in the Department of Prosecution wanted was the decision that was made. The lobbying was intense.
So far.
Because, just a second,
So far.
the lobbying was intense because the issue is a very, very important one. So when it gets to threats, when it gets to we will fix you if you don't go our way, and that doesn't happen very often. I don't believe it happened in SNC-Lavalin.
I want to hear an example of that from the Harper PMO. I want to know, Rachel, I want to know one example of where some lobbyist came to you and said, if you don't see this our way, we are going to make your life a living hell.
Yeah, so a good example of that is any public sector union. They would come regularly to
now come on.
And say, no, seriously, look, if you don't negotiate a collective agreement that's in the interests of our members and provides for wage increases and benefit increases that no other Canadian gets, we're going to campaign against you in the next election. And sure enough, we saw that.
Of course they're going to campaign against you.
Sure, but
come on, Rachel, let's not attack unions here.
But the threats are there that we're going to, spend tens of millions of dollars in our slush fund to run ads against you and campaign against you if you don't do what we want. And that was, those were threats that we heard on a fairly regular basis. But look, I don't blame companies or unions for coming in and trying to lobby for their interests, actually. That's what they're there to do. That's what their representatives are hired to do. They're told to go in and try and make government, operate in a way that works for them. I think where the blame lies here. So look, I don't put any blame on SNC-Lavalin actually for trying to get into the government. I think where the problem is when government was meeting with them, government representatives from the Trudeau PMO, the clerk's office, certainly Minister Morneau's office, were spending so much time and energy meeting with SNC-Lavalin and trying to accommodate their requests. So you get these requests for meetings, requests for policy changes all of the time. When you're meeting with companies dozens of times, putting pressure on your ministers and your attorney general to accede to their requests, I think that's where the real problem is. You cannot leave the impression with Canadians that companies, because of who they are, have better access to government or have access to policy decisions that regular Canadians don't have.
Okay, Rachel, forgive me, I'm jumping in because we're down to our last minute here. I got to let Peggy Nash have a kick at this one too. Inappropriate lobbying versus acceptable lobbying. Where do you see the difference?
Well, two ways. I think acceptable is, first of all, that it's on the record. There's a lobbyist registry, and the phone call from between the former head of the PCO and the current, that's under investigation right now because it was not logged. But it's also, as Rachel says, access. Who gets access? How often do they get access? And if you're a big donor, does that give you more access? And, you know, I think I was opposition industry critic and finance critic, so I got lots of people coming to my office, lots of organizations and interests came to the finance committee, the industry committee. That's all fine. It's part of what you learn as a politician because you're a generalist. These people are specialists, they're experts. So that is all normal. But I think if one organization gets all the access, so for example, to Rachel's point, if all I did was listen to unions and I refused to take meetings from corporations or from others, that would be biased. That would be wrong. And I think you need to have some balance, and you need to genuinely be able to consult.
And that is our time. A very nice discussion, not terribly scandalous at all, I think, actually. Rachel Curran, thanks for being there for us in the nation's capital. The former policy director for Stephen Harper, now with Carleton University. Greg Cerbera, the former Liberal finance minister, now chair of the Cerbera Group and chancellor of York University. Peggy Nash, former NDP MP, now distinguished visiting professor, Ryerson University. Thanks, everybody.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.